With the closing of Pat Sullivan Studios and Pat's untimely passing, Otto had to move on. So the question here is, what happened after? Well, upon Pat's death, Harry Kopp, which we know by now was Pat's longtime attorney, would try to get everything Felix related in order for Patrick Sullivan's estate. This meant that he would have to deal with everyone Pat ever did business with concerning licensing rights based upon Felix, including King's Features Syndicate. See, King's Features Syndicate actually published the comic strips. Harry's mission was to renegotiate with them to continue running the Felix comic strips in order to keep making profits off of merchandising. You have to understand, this was around 1934. Felix had already been gone from the animation space, and several animation studios would take the reins, including Fleischer Studios. We already discussed about them and others in previous episodes. You can view those. The point that I am making here is that Felix wasn't a star anymore, to put it bluntly. So this was the only move to keep Felix's relevancy alive. As for Otto, supposedly Pat had promised him the rights to Felix upon his death. Supposedly. Either way, it was in the best interest of Harry and Otto to maintain the property. They would fight off many who seek to make profit off of Felix illegally. It seemed all there was for Felix was being on merchandise and comic strips. But an opportunity would present itself for our feline that would change the character forever. Otto would languish away at the comic strips. This was his new home. For the most part. We'll touch on what I mean by that later. Anyway, Otto's time at the animation table were done, but an opportunity to get back to his once prominent position presented itself in form of a man by the name of Amedee Van Buren. So, who is Amedee Van Buren? Well, for one, I will be touching upon him very soon in an upcoming episode of his own. But for the context of this episode here, I will say that he was an animation producer just like the others, but not a very successful one. He, alongside Paul Terry, who was also quite a talented animator himself, would produce a plethora of animated shorts in the 20s alone and into the 30s as well. Around the time he hit up Otto, the studio wasn't gaining further success. So out of desperation, he sought out Otto's assistance so that he could bring Felix the Cat to his studio. See, many believe that Otto actually co-owned the rights to Felix, including MGM, which would definitely become a prominent player in the 30s and onward. The studio would house both William Hanna and Joseph Barbera, and we already know what came about with that. But it would be Van Buren who came with the biggest budget and the biggest check. But there was one thing though. Otto didn't want to be involved. You have to remember, this was nearly 5 years since he did animation, and he got so comfortable with drawing strips constantly. He didn't feel that he had the confidence to go back into animation again. Instead, he passed the reins to Burt Gillett. Yes, him. The one who previously left Sullivan Studios to work with Disney. Now he was back to working on Felix cartoons again. But the Bert that worked at Sullivan Studios and the one who would take the reins from Otto would be like night and day. Otto would instantly regret passing up on that opportunity. How? Well, it would all start with their first Felix outing. Felix the Cat and the goose that laid the golden eggs. This would be a part of Van Buren's series of cartoons dubbed The Rainbow Parade. In the short, it had Felix do something for the very first time. Talk.
Good work, Goldie. Keep it up.
Felix was actually voiced for the very first time in animation. Anyway, it had Felix trying to get his golden goose back from Captain Kidd, who steals it for his own gain. Let's cut to the chase. The differences between the original Felix shorts and the ones Van Buren Studios had done would be apparent in this short. First off, considering that Bert Gillett was with Disney for quite a while, his work there would cause an effect which I am dubbing the Disney effect. In other words, he would bring everything he learned at Disney to this short. Felix now shared similarities to Mickey Mouse, even down to the voice of Felix himself. The animation itself would resemble what Disney was doing at the time. Sure, it would have some of his trademark traits, such as Felix shooting himself out of a cannon as a cannonball, and him having his trademark thinking while walking. But the influence for Felix's design and characteristics were evident. On top of that, Bert Gillett even tried to run the production just like he did at Disney. The second short, Neptune's Nonsense, has Felix trying to find a companion for his goldfish, so he ends up underwater and meets Neptune himself. The third short, Bold King Cole, even had Felix sing in it, serenading. Otto would see what was done with Felix, and he was quite displeased with the shorts, noting to Bert that he tried to push his own characters, and Felix mounted to nothing but a side character. No matter if he was right or not, it didn't matter, because Van Buren would be the one to lose out in the end. The studio would lose its distribution deal when RKO signed on to work with Walt Disney in that same year. The fact was that Disney had changed the animation space and others had made an impression as well on audiences. Felix wasn't needed on screens anymore. As for Otto, he would manage to languish on with the comic strips at least, until 1943 when the Sunday strips was discontinued. But Felix wouldn't disappear from paper. He still had the daily strips and he would make his debut in comic books as well. Otto would draw the comics for a while and it had a great run. He would make his way back into the animation world in a way. He would lend his services to famous studios, so you can already guess what he had his hands on from hearing the name of the studio. But Otto would really do it basically as a part-time job. So what did he do for his full-time work? Well, you can see the remnants of what he did in New York City, particularly Times Square. Those bright lights that would animate a character for the public to see at night while walking. Yes, that was his doing, as Otto would work with Douglas Lee, who was known as the lamplighter of Broadway, from 1937 to the day that he retired in 1973. Despite doing this job, he still dedicated his time to doing the comic books and the daily strips. But Otto wasn't the man that he was before, where he could take on a lot. He needed help, and King's Feature Syndicate wasn't particularly satisfied with his output at the publication, as they felt his style was outdated at this point. Otto would get that help that he needed, and his name would be Joe Oriolo. Now, who's Joe Oriolo? Well, for one, he worked at famous studios as a draftsman and an animator. He was one of the many animators responsible for animating Betty Boop and Popeye. So to say that he was the right man for the job would be quite the understatement. For good reason, because he would also be responsible for the creation of another beloved cartoon character as well. Casper the Friendly Ghost. Being experienced already, Joe would prove that as he would slowly start to take over Mesmer's run on the comic books and everything related to Felix. Mesmer had finally felt that he left Felix in good hands, and he would see the result of the faith that he put in Joe. In 1958, as he would bring Felix somewhere he had been before.
Felix the cat, the wonderful, wonderful cat. Whenever he gets in a fix, he reaches into his bag of tricks. Felix the cat, the wonderful, wonderful cat. You laugh so much your sides will ache, your heart will go pit-a-pat. Watching Felix, the wonderful cat.
Lo and behold, Felix the Cat made his return as a full-fledged cartoon character for television. This would be where we would see the redesign of Felix in full-on animation, albeit a very limited animation style. This is what Joe Oriolo would conjure up. Supposedly, this series only made it to television because Joe himself fronted half of the money to be made. This was due to the lack of faith other studios had in Felix. They felt that the character was outdated for them to work with. Nevertheless, this was Felix, and what audiences would see here wouldn't be the Felix of old. This cartoon series would take Felix in another direction. First off, Felix would sport a new redesign as we come to know of him today. His long-legged appearance.
Sir has snapped his mainspring.
Also, Felix would once again be voiced, but this time Felix would have his own personality that was more jovial, as he loved to laugh a lot in this iteration. A lot. But at the same time, he would resemble the Felix of old, as it kept his trademark walking while thinking and his knack for solving a problem ahead of him. Felix would also get something that would become an iconic staple to the character going forward. The Bag of Magic Tricks. This would take place of Felix's metamorphic traits. Well, for the most part. Nevertheless, it would prove to be a great addition to the character. Since this was a cartoon series made for kids, Felix had to have a cast of characters to contend with, just like the formula many cartoons would employ around this era of TV animation. First, we have the Professor. He was mostly the main bad guy who always tried some kind of scheme to steal Felix's bag of tricks, to mostly no avail. Then you had Rockbottom, a cigar-chomping bulldog who served mostly as the Professor's sidekick. Next, you had Poindexter, Felix's best friend and the Professor's nephew. He would help out Felix and vice versa, and had a very serviceable lab coat to boot. And lastly, you had an evil robot who always tried to kidnap Poindexter for some reason. The cartoon was the typical hijinks of the day, and definitely wore its influence on its sleeve, mainly Hanna-Barbera's cartoons at the time. Also, it was quite tame as well. Felix would always overcome the Professor with his thinking, never with any amount of violence added. But he always managed to have a laugh at the end. He even had his own catchphrase as well. The series would get a second season in 1959, but alas, nothing would come past that second season. A second series was planned, but Translux refused to fund further cartoons. So, that was it. At least it would languish in syndication as many of the cartoons of that era had. Besides, it didn't matter, because Felix would still have his run in the comics, and Felix's merchandising appeal had grown stronger than ever before. The cat still had some of his 9 lives left. This was all due to Oriolo's effort. See, how it would all come about is that he actually made his own company called Felix the Cat Productions Incorporated, alongside Patrick Sullivan, the nephew. Yes, his nephew was also named Pat. But he was very different from his uncle. He would be instrumental in not only reinstating the rights of Felix, but also making sure Otto was finally credited as a collaborator. But it would be Oriolo who saw something in Felix and he invested in the future, something Otto wouldn't do. His admiration for his mentor had fueled him to carry on Felix's legacy. And he would continue on and produce another animated series called The Mighty Hercules for television as well. It would be a moderate success for him. But it would be in the 1980s where he would take our feline into the modern era. But this would also be his last stand. The 80s would roll around, and as we already know by now, this would be a decade of animation that would house several cartoons that would become classics today. Joe Oriolo would be faced with a dilemma: how to continue on with Felix the Cat. Well, it didn't seem too difficult. See, by the end of the 70s, Felix was already languishing in merchandising. Oriolo would make the rounds worldwide to make sure Felix kept going. He also would do something he felt was long overdue. In 1975, while attending a retrospective for Felix at the American Film Institute at the Kennedy Center for its 2nd anniversary, he boldly claimed that it was Otto who had truly created Felix the Cat. Just as I said before, it's up to you, the viewer, to determine who actually created Felix the Cat. Nevertheless, Otto would finally receive the accolade and be recognized as the man he wanted to be remembered as, the one who gave it his all. But his biggest accolade would come in 1979, where he would be rewarded by the International Animation Film Society with their highest honor, the Winsor McCay Award, for his long service in animation. Everything had came full circle. He was now honored in the name of the man that inspired him to pursue his dream to become an animator. This was a prestigious moment for Otto, and he could finally hang his hat in pride. So, into the 1980s, Felix was already in a good place, considering a new generation of children were being exposed to the previous anime series in syndication. This made Joe try to capitalize off that reception and pave a new avenue for Felix. How would he do this? Well, he would do this in 1982, as Felix would make his way back to screens in a brand new way, with Felix the Cat live. Yes, you heard that correctly. Live action Felix. This entire series would come into fruition through Oriolo Film Studios, which Joe started alongside his business partner, Burt Hecht. So what was the show about? Well, it was basically their version of Sesame Street, as Felix would teach various historical and educational lessons to a group of kids who visited him. Now, you may be thinking if this show was a success in its initial run. Well, considering how very obscure it is to a point where it has almost nearly been forgotten about, that should be your answer. Nevertheless, it would air for 52 episodes in total. Things would be good on Oriolo's end, but how about Otto? Well, by this time, he would continue to languish peacefully in retirement. Gone from the drawing boards, gone from the animation table. Otto had achieved what he sought out to do. And now the next stage of his life would come about. On October 28, 1983, Otto Mesmer would pass away in his home at the age of 91. After he died, he was honored with a huge obituary in the New York Times. The news of his passing would be known worldwide. Otto had finally made people see him for his contribution to the world of animation, so he could rest in peace knowing that. Felix would continue on with Joe at the helm, as he knew he had to carry the torch of his mentor. So, Joe wanted to do something big again with Felix. He wanted to bring him back to the realm he once roamed, and he would do it alongside a collaborator he knew pretty closely. That collaborator would be none other than his own son, Don Oriolo. They both worked diligently, trying to make something great, but things would come to a halt. On December 25th, 1985, Joe Oriolo would pass away at the age of 72 in his Hackensack, New Jersey home. The father of modern Felix the Cat was gone, the man that kept Felix alive and set him up for the future. Joe and Otto were now gone. Who would carry the torch and continue Felix's trajectory to stardom? It would be none other than Don Oriolo who would step up to the plate, and he made every attempt to do so. Audiences would once again get to see Felix return to the realm he once roamed.
He's the dreamer who charmed the world, the hero who never gave up, the clown who became one of the most beloved characters in animated history. And now, Felix is a major motion picture.
Here it is, Felix the Cat, the movie. First off, let's get some details straightened out, shall we? Okay, technically, the film would be made around 1986 and 87, and it would be released on October 1988, but not in America. It would actually be in Europe. It was supposed to be released in the United States on Thanksgiving Day of 1990, but it got delayed until 1991. Now, I just want to say for the record, even these details are a bit shaky, but one thing that is concrete is that the film would have a VHS release on August of 1991. Oh, speaking of Europe, this is where the production would take place actually. See, what happened is that originally this was supposed to be just a TV special, but Don wanted to do something special, so he took the project overseas, Hungary to be exact, and it would be passed off to a director by the name of Tibor Hernati. Felix the Cat, the movie, would cost a whopping $9 million to make. This was quite expensive for an animation film around this time, but alas, the budget was spent on making the film Don wanted. So, what was the film about? Well, in this movie, Felix is transported to another world where he must save Princess Oriana from the clutches of a mad scientist by the name of Duke of Zil and his robotic army. The movie would also employ the use of early CG animation in the intro as well. It seemed that the animation team's effort would pay off, except that it didn't. See, the film would only make close to $2 million at the box office, and as I mentioned, it cost $9 million to make. Ouch. It also has the reputation of being one of the worst films ever made by many who have seen it as well. So, it's definitely easy to say that this movie was not a success in the slightest. Despite the box office failure of Felix the Cat the movie, Felix would still continue to languish in many merchandising adverts for companies such as Wendy's and Carl's Jr., to name a few. But that wouldn't be all for Felix, not by a long shot. In 1992, Felix would delve into another medium that was incredibly popular with kids at the time: video games. Felix made his way to the Nintendo Entertainment System, with Hudson Soft at the helm. Felix the Cat would also get a follow-up game for the Nintendo Game Boy a year later as well. You have to remember, this was the 90s. As we've seen in previous episodes, some classic characters would make their way back to airwaves in some form or fashion. Guess who went in on action as well? Let's see who. Lo and behold, on September 16th, 1995, Felix the Cat would make his entrance back into the animation space with The Twisted Tales of Felix the Cat, on Saturday mornings no less. This anime series would be a collaboration of Felix the Cat Productions and Film Roman, who already had their hands in some of the most successful Saturday morning cartoons on air around this time, such as Bobby's World on Fox Kids, and he would also produce the Saturday morning classic Garfield and Friends, which unfortunately would conclude its run on CBS the year prior. The Twisted Tales of Felix the Cat would be sort of a return to form for Felix. Gone was the jovial attitude and constant laughing. Felix was back to being the mischievous cat that he was in the original shorts. Felix even got his metamorphic traits back in this iteration. This was Felix's return to what made him the cartoon star in the first place. But this is speaking for the character itself. As for the show, the aesthetic would be a combination of the 1920s and 30s cartoons in general, but in a surreal environment where everything came to life. And when I say surreal, I mean it in a very extreme way. This would be unlike anything that had been done with Felix before, but this style would already be in use by the time this series aired. On Nickelodeon, with Joe Murray's creation and Nicktoons' classic, Rocko's Modern Life, which would be on its third season around this time, by the way. It would have an influence on this iteration of Felix, even down to the art style and the humor as well. So, how would it do so? Well, let's take the very first segment in the very first episode, for example. In it, you know what? It's better if you just see it yourself.
I'll have a salad, please.
And what kind would you like?
What kind do you have?
None!
Huh?
Perhaps you haven't seen the menu. Look around. All I have is meat. Listen to me now. Food is better when it's meaty. Here, have a scrumptious treaty.
Like my T-bone sweetie.
Meat, meat, meat. My pork may squeal and whistle as I grind them into gristle.
Now here on me gristle, meat, meat.
Try the beef instead, we're better when we're dead.
I think I'm underfed.
Yeah. If you thought that was off the wall, the rest of the episode follows suit, including a vacuum cleaner that tells Felix he doesn't want to clean his house anymore and runs away from home. What ensues after is beyond comprehension, but this is the direction that the series was going for. Pure shock value and weirdness. Now, would this spell success for the Twisted Tales of Felix the Cat? Unfortunately, the answer is no. Many factors would play into this answer. First off, by the end of the first season, the Twisted Tales of Felix the Cat was losing ratings at an alarming rate. Second, you have to remember, well, if you don't, let me explain. See, this was 1995, and the competition was heavy on Saturday mornings. The time slot that the Twisted Tales of Felix the Cat inhabited had one of the biggest cartoons of the day. And it would be on Fox Kids. So what was it? Well, it would be none other than That's right, the X-Men. I can presume that most of the viewers of this channel know how big of a deal this cartoon was at the time. On top of that, there was this huge comic book boom in the 90s as well, which added more onto the success of Marvel's classic anime series. It was the talk at many playgrounds of the day. So it's easy to say that Felix really never stood a chance. But nevertheless, it would eventually get a second season on CBS. Supposedly, Don Oriolo absolutely hated the direction of the cartoon, as he felt it didn't pay homage to the original characters, and the focus wasn't on Felix anymore. He also hated how characters like the Professor and Rockbottom were portrayed in the second season. These were characters that his father painstakingly created, and they were being used to his unliking. Changes were made in an attempt to retool the series from the reception the first season had gotten. It didn't matter, because the Twisted Tales of Felix the Cat would not be renewed for a third season. With the fair reception of both the movie and the Twisted Tales of Felix the Cat, it seemed that Felix's shot back to the top of cartoon stardom was put to rest for the remainder of the decade. But Don Oriolo wouldn't let Felix sit out for too long. Felix had one last shot at cartoon stardom left in him. This would come at the turn of the century, the year 2000. He would make his way back into the animation space in a very unusual way. Here it is, Felix's next outing, Baby Felix and Friends. This one would be quite different in many ways. First, Don Oriolo would choose to outsource the animation this time around, due to his dissatisfaction with Film Roman's handling of Felix with the Twisted Tales of Felix the Cat. So, where would he get it outsourced to? Well, Japan, of course. Yes, Felix was now an anime character. This series would be a collaboration with Radix. Now, who is Radix? Well, to most, Radix would be virtually unknown to those outside of Japan and have no prior knowledge of Japanese animation. But they would land with something on American shores that might be familiar to some. This would be Android Kikaider. It would make its way to Adult Swim 3 years later in 2003. So it seemed that they were a capable studio to do the animation for the show. Besides, you have to remember, this was 2000. Anime around this time had already gained a massive foothold on cable and network television. This included the likes of Pokemon, Dragon Ball Z, and Sailor Moon, with all three of these going back as far as 1998. So it's easy to say that anime was the next wave in TV animation at this point. I will touch upon anime in another episode in the future. I promise. Anyway, the second difference would be something odd for the character. As you can tell from the title, you already know what the concept is already. Yes, the successful formula that made Muppet Babies a bona fide hit on Saturday mornings and Tom and Jerry Kids was now being used to push Felix into the eyes of newly cartoon and anime fans. So, what was the premise of Baby Felix and Friends? First off, it would be a sort of sequel to Joe Oriolo's Felix the Cat, as that Felix travels back in time to give his infant self the iconic bag of tricks. But it would mainly take place with Felix as infant. It would also bring on new characters as well, such as Mookie, Mimi, Skippy, and Tattoo. In addition, even old characters like the Professor and Poindexter would make a return to this series as well. And yes, Kitty Cat would make a return as well, as a baby of course. Isn't she so adorable? Besides that, Baby Felix and Friends was basically along the lines of Muppet Babies, with Felix and the gang finding hijinks and misadventures wherever they went. I wish I could tell you that it was more than this, but the fact is that Baby Felix and Friends was just something for the very young audience to sink their teeth into. It would get 65 episodes at least, and it would go on to inspire another babyfication series, Baby Looney Tunes, a year later on Kids WB. Guess that's good, right? This would be it for Felix, because in 2014, Don Oriolo would sell the rights to Felix to DreamWorks Animation. That was it. Felix had finally lost all of his 9 lives. Or did he? Since Don Oriolo sold off Felix to DreamWorks, he put his full concentration on what he loved to do the most, making music. See, what should be known is that Don Oriolo was also a musician and dabbled in music publishing. He was also a record producer as well. Felix the Cat was something that he promised his dad he would continue to carry on. He did the best that he could, but sometimes you have to hang your hat and walk away. He did just that. Today, Don's work on Felix has long been behind him, as he runs his own guitar company and farming venture. But from time to time, he reminds the people of his love of the character that made him the man who would be instrumental with Felix lasting as long as he did. So the question is, what is Felix's relevancy in the world of animation? Well, even though Felix was a character that was a product of his time, he would turn out to be a character that kids could have fun with. No matter what anyone feels about Patrick Sullivan, one thing stands. He brought us a character who gave us a reason to laugh and think as well. But it is Otto who deserves the credit for Felix. I'm not saying that because I think he created him. I'm saying this because it was Otto who inspired any kid who picked up that Felix the Cat comic book and became artists themselves. It was Otto who made a kid smile when they looked at that comic strip. Ultimately, it would be Otto who inspired the man who would go on to create a Felix that we would all come to know and love. This was all to his nature. A nature that was of kindness and that was nurturing. A man who was so passionate about his art that he willfully passed his dream onto his protege, who in turn passed it on to us. Felix is more than a character. Felix is a treasure. He endured through every generation of animation, and even though he could never become what he was back then, Felix will always be known as the very first cartoon star. Felix will always be known as the comic strip dynamo. Felix will always be known as an unsung comic book pioneer. You can see a lot of Felix in a lot of cartoon characters today. Even though Felix isn't the star today like he was back then, somewhere on this planet, you can find someone who has a Felix clock hanging on their wall or a Felix t-shirt. Speaking of t-shirt, Felix would add a new title to his name, the Fashion Star. In 2021, Levi's rolled out their special collection of shirts and jackets that adorned Felix the Cat's image. Not bad for our feline. That's all fine and dandy, but Felix's true place has always been in the comics and on TV screens. Apparently, Source Point Press agrees as well. In 2022, they will team up with DreamWorks Animation to bring a new comic book series to store shelves. And there are rumors circling of a brand new cartoon series coming as well. So, that ebony, mischievous, magic bag carrying, chuckling feline has managed to wraggle his way back into our hearts. Who would have knew? But, on the other hand, that's Felix the Cat. The wonderful, wonderful cat. Once again, he reached into his bag of tricks and pulled out the greatest one he could for us, filling our hearts with laughter and enjoyment. I would love to thank you all for watching. Felix is a character that is the blueprint of animation itself. When you think of a cartoon, Felix is the definition of what a cartoon character is. It was absolutely a delight taking you all on this journey with me through this gallery, exploring Felix the Cat. It was so great doing this entire two-part, and if I could do it all over again, I would. That's how much admiration I have for this character. And I hope by the end of this episode that you have as well. As always, I would first like to thank these people here. Without them, this episode wouldn't have turned out the way it did. Also, I want to thank all of the new subscribers on this channel. This makes me so happy to see you all subscribed. And I loved answering your comments while I worked on this episode. It kept me going. That sentiment goes out to the previous subscribers as well. As always, if you aren't a subscriber, please subscribe to the channel. It would greatly help me out. Also, please press that like button and that notification bell so you can be notified of future content down the pipeline. Lastly, please share the episode with those who might love the content. That also greatly helps me out as well. I will continue to dive deep into the history of the studios that brought us childhood memories and the animation that made us imaginative. With that said, this is where I have to bid you all farewell. Please come back as we delve into another piece of animation history throughout the gallery on the next episode of the Cartoon Curator. Till then, Godspeed.